The German retreat on October 29th was a planned move. The bulk of their 15th Army in Western Brabant would move behind the River Mark as a final stand south of the Meuse, while Steenbergen would serve as a bulwark south of this river. Here they had their best troops, remnants of the 6th Parachute Regiment and the other elements of Battle Group Chiel, like the Hermann Göring Training Battalion and an assault gun brigade. Despite the slow Canadian pursuit, the retreat of the Fallschirmjäger didn't go without incident. The 9th Company of the 6th Parachute Regiment was building a new defensive line from the Oud-Glimmispolder to Klutsdorp. It was also its task to provide a detachment to destroy the cable ferry between Oud and New Vosmeer. What the Fallschirmjäger didn't know was that the resistance of the island of Tholen had taken matters in their own hands. Armed with weapons they had stolen or otherwise obtained, they had practically liberated the island themselves. As a result, the German Fallschirmjäger were suddenly faced with an unexpected enemy, inexperienced, barely armed but highly motivated resistance fighters. On October 30th, the resistance did what they could best and ambushed the Germans. As a result, half of the 9th Company was captured. The liberation of Tholen by the Dutch resistance had some far-reaching consequences involving the fate of the 6th Parachute Regiment. The control of Tholen Island by Allied forces meant that the Germans could no longer reinforce their beleaguered garrison at Walcheren via the Eastern Scheldt. The sea line into the Eastern Scheldt ran straight in front of an observation post on the tip of Tholen Island, overlooking the Eastern Scheldt. If the Allies could call in artillery or air support, a passing German convoy would be finished. This had consequences for the resupply of the island of Walcheren. By the end of October 1944, Walcheren was holding out against the Canadian attack from the east, but the German garrison forces were weak, third-rate troops, which could not hope to fight off a determined attack. In order to bolster the garrison, General Kurt Student planned to send the remnants of the 6th Parachute Regiment from Dinterloord by boat to Walcheren. This had to be done on short notice because the Fallschirmjäger were still on the front line. But it was essential to keep the German stranglehold on the Western Scheldt to prevent the use of the port of Antwerp until the start of the Ardennes offensive. The Fallschirmjäger would have given the Walcheren garrison a chance to stave off Allied land-borne attacks, but the capture of Tholen Island made this plan unfeasible. The cancellation gave the 6th Parachute Regiment a second chance of life and saved it from demise on the doomed island of Walcheren, and it was given an opportunity for an eventual rebuilding. Meanwhile, the Germans tried to extract the 6th Parachute Regiment from the front line at the end of October. Its 1st Battalion moved to Zijpe via Anna-Jacoba-polder to prevent an Allied landing on the island of Schouwen-Duiveland, which was the base of the German Navy SEALs. The 2nd Battalion moved to Dinterloord and the 4th Battalion moved to Willemstad, while the 3rd Battalion formed the rear guard. That's why the 9th Company of the latter was involved in the skirmish with the resistance on Tholen. The bulk of the 3rd Battalion was left behind just south of Steenbergen to make a last stand. At this stage the battalions were no longer anything to speak about, and each company was down to a few dozen men. A battalion at this stage would consist at most of 100 men. The Fallschirmjäger around Steenbergen were for this reason reinforced with the remnants of the Hermann Göring troops and a handful of assault guns of the 667th Assault Gun Detachment. South of Steenbergen, the village of Welberg was an obvious defensive position. It was an elevated position that was on average 4 meters higher than the surrounding area, and the built-up area was stretched on an east-west axis. It was an obvious defensive line from attacks coming from the south, and it commanded the road to Steenbergen. On October 31st, the Germans were properly installed in the new positions, and the Allies had largely caught up with them. The Allied tanks were kept at bay due to mines and a tank wall, so it was up to the Canadian infantry. The Algonquin Regiment was at that stage in a bad shape, and just like their German opponents, its companies were down to several dozen men. In order to maximize their chances, they advanced after dark, expecting the Germans to be asleep. That evening, the Canadians of the Algonquin Regiment split their forces with the aim to take Welberg and Steenbergen. The plan was to advance abreast and secure Welberg before moving into Steenbergen. It was a bold and ambitious plan, because the troops had to cover 4 kilometers in full gear cross-country in night time. By 4 o'clock, A and C Company had reached Welberg and were ordered to halt because B Company on the left struggled to advance and was eventually halted by the Fallschirmjäger, blocking the main road to Steenbergen. While the troops at Welberg waited, they were suddenly attacked by the Hermann Göring troops, supported by assault guns. The first attack was beaten off, but a more determined German attack at dawn was successful. The Canadians were overrun and the remnants had to beat a hasty retreat. A Company commander was captured, and dozens of Canadians were killed, wounded or captured. Only a few men made it back all the way to the start line. The successful German counterattack was so remarkable that the commander of 15th Army expressed his appreciation. The Canadians tried to attack again on November 2nd. Fresh forces were pulled in, and this time they would attack with 2 battalions. The fresh Lincoln and Welland Regiment would attack towards Steenbergen, while the battered Algonquin Regiment would move to a secondary road as a new jump-off position to attack Welberg again. This time the Canadians were backed up by tank destroyers, and the suspected German positions were extensively bombarded by both the artillery and the air force before the infantry would attack. After sunset, the Canadians went into the attack. The vanguard of the Algonquin Regiment ran into trouble when they reached Welberg at 8 o'clock, when the Germans raised the alarm and they became entangled in vicious street fight. The latter got the upper hand and the Algonquin had to retreat and reached the starting line by midnight. The Algonquin Regiment had, however, another ace on its sleeve. This time they sent C and D Company via dirt roads further east to sneak up to the Germans from that direction. Before dawn, the Canadians went all in to storm Welberg from the south and the east. The Germans were, however, not keen on giving up yet. It took the Canadians up to noon before the village was cleared. Meanwhile, the Lincoln and Welland Regiment also had difficulty advancing against the Fallschirmjäger, but by the end of the afternoon they linked up with the Algonquin Regiment at Welberg. The Canadians were exhausted, and the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, the remaining battalion of the 10th Brigade, had to relieve them for the final assault on Steenbergen. Once again, the Fallschirmjäger had seriously degraded the combat effectiveness of a Canadian brigade. By November 3rd, the Germans had halted the Canadian 4th Armored Division for 3 full days. But the battle took an unexpected turn due to the simultaneous crossing of the Mark River at Stampenschat and Standaarbuiten that same day. This made the German position at Steenbergen untenable, and by the morning of November 4th, the Germans had evacuated. The remnants of the 3rd Battalion of the 6th Parachute Regiment managed to evacuate under the cover of darkness. The remnants of the other battalions had evacuated except the 4th Battalion, which would be evacuated from Willemstad on November 6th. The evacuation of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment from northern Brabant seemed to have saved the regiment from destruction once again. But von der Heydte had other plans. Von der Heydte was promoted away to lead the Fallschirmarmee Waffenschule, a special battalion for students' parachute army for the training of specialists and officers. In reality, this unit was a cover-up to allow him to select and train troops for a highly secret mission in the context of the Ardennes offensive. Heydte got the backing of Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring and took this opportunity to take the best officers and men from the remnants of the 6th Parachute Regiment for his mission. This extraction meant that the regiment was basically deprived of its backbone of veterans, and it would never fully recover from this extraction. Thank you very much for your attention for this final episode on the series of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment. Please like and subscribe if you like this content, and buy me a coffee if you really appreciate my work. And see you for the next videos.